He was a man Hollywood once worshipped. A face carved like a Greek statue, a talent that reinvented acting itself. But behind that impossible beauty was a childhood of violence, a mother drowning in alcohol, and a lifetime of battles he could never escape. And even more shocking, the tragedy that shattered his entire family would become one of the darkest chapters in Hollywood history. How could the greatest icon of his generation fall so far? Rare photos and untold truths will be revealed. Stay to the end to understand why Marlon Brando remains a legend wrapped in sorrow. Long before Hollywood learned his name, Marlon Brando was just a trouble boy growing up in a small house on the flat, windswept streets of Omaha, Nebraska. He was born on April 3rd, 1924, into a family that looked respectable from the outside, but was quietly falling apart from within. His father, Marlon Brando Sr., was a stern, emotionally distant man who believed discipline was the only language a child should understand. His mother, Dorothy, was fragile yet artistic, a woman whose gentle spirit was slowly drowned by alcohol. The contrast inside that home was sharp. A father who rarely showed affection, and a mother who often disappeared into her own haze. Marlon, the youngest of 3 children, learned early that love came in conditions and comfort came in brief, unpredictable moments. When Dorothy was sober, she encouraged his imagination, taught him to observe people, to mimic voices, to study emotions. But when her addiction took over, she became unreachable, leaving Marlon with deep fear of abandonment that would haunt every relationship he ever formed. He once described his father's presence as walking on a floor of thin ice. Brando Sr. demanded perfection and mocked any sign of weakness. Young Marlon responded the only way he knew, by rebelling. He acted out at school, broke rules, skipped classes, and frequently found himself in trouble. Teachers called him defiant. In reality, he was a child desperate for attention in a household where vulnerability was punished. By the time he reached his teens, the emotional tension at home became unbearable. His parents separated, reunited, fought again, a cycle that left deep cracks in his sense of stability. To control him, his father sent Marlon to Shattuck Military Academy in Minnesota, a place where discipline was absolute and rebellion was not tolerated. But the rigid environment only intensified his restlessness. He clashed with instructors, pulled pranks, and resisted any form of order. Eventually, he was expelled, an event that would quietly shape his hatred for rules and structured systems for his life. There are rare photos from this period, grainy black and white shots of young Brando standing on the walls of beating cadets. His posture relaxed when everyone else was stiff, his eyes drifting somewhere far beyond the camera. Even then, he inflicted all others tried to force him into the quiet defiance, the simmering anger, the sadness behind his charisma was already visible. His mother's alcoholism worsened as he grew older. Her emotional absence became and carried into adulthood. Years later, he would admit that every character portrayed on the screen came from watching her fragility, her unpredictable moods. The tragedy of woman whose brilliance was dimmed by addiction, who loved her deeply. Yet he never forgave the pain and absence created. These early fractures, the cold father, the unstable mother, the chaos at home, shaped Marlon Brando far more than fame ever could. Before he became the most desired man in Hollywood, he was a boy running from a family he couldn't fix and a past he could never outrun. After being expelled from military school, Marlon Brando drifted through his late teens with no clear direction, working odd jobs and trying to outrun the emotional debris of his childhood. But fate intervened to the one person who still believed in him, his mother. Despite her struggles with alcohol, Dorothy recognized a spark in her son, a raw emotional intensity that few could ignore. She urged him to pursue acting, the craft she once loved but never mastered. For the first time, Marlon had a path. In 1943, he moved to New York City, a place of chaos, neon lights, and endless reinvention. The city swallowed him whole, but also offered him something he had never known: freedom. He studied under Stella Adler, the legendary acting coach who introduced him to method, a deep, psychological approach that demanded actors mind their own trauma to create truth on stage. For Brando, whose life was already a reservoir of pain, it felt natural. Adler once said he had the soul of an exposed nerve. She was right. Those early days were far from glamorous. Brando lived in small rented rooms, often skipping meals, surviving on determination and an instinctive ability to observe human behavior. He spent hours watching strangers on the subway, memorizing gestures, the way people carried their loneliness, their pride, their fears. These observations became the foundation of his craft. His breakthrough came almost by accident. In 1947, he was cast as Stanley Kowalski in the Broadway production of A Streetcar Named Desire. The role demanded raw masculinity, emotional volatility, and animal-like presence, qualities Brando possessed effortlessly. When the curtain rose on opening night, the audience wasn't prepared. He wasn't acting, he was living. His performance was electric, dangerous, and unprecedented. There are rare photos from that era. Backstage shot of Brando in a white tank top, sweat glistening on his skin, leaning against the wall with a distant stare. Even in stillness, he radiated intensity. He didn't resemble the polished Hollywood stars of time. He was real, almost too real, and audiences were hypnotized. Hollywood came calling soon after. Studios wanted to mold him into their next leading man. But Brando he hated rehearsals. It's like often changed. Yet his talent was undeniable. In 1950, he was used to go across directed by Elliot Zahn. The movie was Brando's performance was turbulent moments and shocking overnight. But unlike most of his stories, Brando didn't chase the studio saw the rise of legend. It saw machines that control it, much like the institutions that dominate his internal conflict, tensions, and brilliance and rebellion, which shaped every chapter of his career. Still, in these early years, there was hope, there was fire, there was a promise of a man destined to remake Hollywood in his own image. What no one knew was that the same emotional depths that fueled his genius would soon become the source of his destruction. Hollywood in the 1950s was a kingdom built on illusions, perfect faces, flawless reputations, and carefully orchestrated dreams. But when Marlon Brando arrived, he didn't just fit into the system, he shattered it. His performance in A Streetcar Named Desire was only the beginning. The industry had never seen an actor who combined brutality and vulnerability with such unsettling authenticity. He didn't act like a movie star. He behaved like a man ripped open. In 1954, Brando delivered what would become one of the most iconic performances in cinema history, Terry Malloy in On the Waterfront. The film earned him his first Academy Award, and with it, a level of superstardom that very few had ever experienced. Suddenly, magazine photographers and studio executives were orbiting around him. His face, sharp jawline, smoldering eyes, and an expression that always seemed to take pain and pride became a new standard of masculinity. There are countless photos from this period. Brando on set with a cigarette loosely hanging from his lips, sitting on a rooftop between takes, or leaning on a railing, his eyes glistened. Even in candid shots, he radiated something magnetic, something impossible to replicate. Fans called him the most beautiful man alive. Critics called him the future of American acting. Hollywood called him a phenomenon, but fame didn't sit comfortably on Brando's shoulders. The spotlight that made him a legend also exposed his insecurities, his need for solitude, and his growing distrust in the industry. He hated interviews, refused to play the charming celebrity. He turned down roles that others would kill for, ignored studio roles, and developed a reputation for being unpredictable. Directors admired his genius, but feared his volatility behind closed doors. He struggled with the emotional chaos that followed him since childhood. The adoration of millions did nothing to silence his internal storms. He sabotaged relationships, distanced himself from friends, and numbed his unrest with impulsive decisions. At the height of his fame, he bought a private island in Tahiti, an escape, a sanctuary, a place where Hollywood couldn't reach him. It was a beautiful dream, but it also symbolized his growing isolation. Meanwhile, the media constructed an image of Brando as the ultimate rebel, the brooding sex symbol, the man who made vulnerability look powerful. But the real Marlon Brando was far more complicated. He was sensitive yet guarded, brilliant yet self-destructive, adored yet constantly fleeing affection. Stardom amplified these contradictions, turning him into a man at war with himself. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, Brando's career soared with films like Sayonara, Young Lions, and Creature of the Kind. He was nominated for multiple Oscars. His stardom seemed unstoppable, and yet cracks were already forming beneath the surface. He became increasingly difficult on set, often clashing with producers and rewriting his own lines. His weight fluctuated. He began showing up late, or not at all. Rumors swirled. The icon who had revitalized Hollywood was slowly drifting away from it. The world saw a legend unfold, but inside, the man behind the veil was beginning to crumble. Fame didn't corrupt Marlon Brando overnight. It fractured him slowly, like a mirror cracking under its own reflection. By the early 1960s, the world still saw a godlike figure, the rebel who changed acting forever, the man whose face could launch an era. But behind closed doors, Brando was drifting into a chaos he could no longer disguise. Hollywood called him brilliant. Hollywood also called him impossible. Directors complained that he challenged every instruction. Producers wrote panic-filled memos about his lateness, his sudden withdrawals, his refusal to say lines he considered dishonest. For Brando, these were not acts of defiance. They were acts of survival. He believed Hollywood expected him to bleed for every role, to turn his inner wounds into entertainment. After years of doing exactly that, the emotional cost became unbearable. His rebellion didn't stop at work. His personal life turned into an unpredictable storm. Brando collected relationships the way other men collected trophies. Beautiful women, co-stars, models, intellectuals, strangers he met at parties. Some described him as tender, others as distant, restless, or emotionally unreachable. Over time, more than 30 lovers entered and exited his orbit. Brando never denied it. In fact, he admitted that intimacy frightened him. The wounds of his mother's absence and his father's cruelty made permanence feel like a threat, not a comfort. Photos from this era tell a story the tabloids never understood. In many, Brando stands surrounded by adoring crowds, women holding his arms, studio executives smiling behind him. But focus on his eyes. They are distant, unfocused, as if searching for an escape route. For a man worshipped by millions, he looked strangely alone. As the spotlight intensified, so did his self-destructive habits. He ate compulsively, sometimes in binges so extreme that his weight would swing wildly over short periods of time. Reporters captured him late at night, leaving restaurants, shielding his face from flashbulbs. Headlines mocked him mercilessly. Brando losing control, Hollywood's fallen icon. The man once celebrated as the embodiment of masculine perfection became the subject of cruel jokes. He pretended not to care. But the photographs, those unguarded, exhausted, heavy-eyed images, revealed a man who cared deeply. Professionally, he made choices that puzzled even his closest friends. His behavior during production of Mutiny on the Bounty, 1962, became infamous. He rewrote scenes, ignored direction, and argued relentlessly with the crew. The budget exploded. The film nearly collapsed. Studio executives blamed one man. And when the dust settled, Brando, once Hollywood's most valuable actor, found himself unofficially blacklisted. Studios whispered warnings. Don't hire him. He'll destroy your movie. But even this period of decline couldn't bury his genius. When he wanted to, he could deliver performances so powerful they left directors speechless. The problem was that Brando no longer wanted to submit to the system. He was exhausted by it. Acting, once the only place he felt understood, had become another cage. Then came a role that would ignite a scandal still debated today. Last Tango in Paris, 1972. Brando later confessed that the emotional demands of the film reopened traumas he had spent his entire life burying. The shoot was chaotic, psychologically invasive, and left him feeling exposed in ways he never anticipated. The controversy haunted him for decades. In rare behind-the-scenes photos, he sits alone on set, staring into the floor, his shoulders heavy, his expression drained, an image far removed from the confident rebel the world believed him to be. By the mid-1970s, Brando's relationship with Hollywood was a battlefield of resentment and fear. His talent was monumental, but his demons were larger still, and they were about to drag him into a darker, more devastating chapter, one that no actor, no father, no human being could walk away from unchanged. The scandals of Marlon Brando's career wounded him. The tragedies within his family nearly destroyed him. By the late 1970s and 1980s, Brando had built a life of isolation, retreating to his private island in Tahiti, then returning sporadically to Los Angeles for work or legal matters. Outsiders thought he was eccentric, difficult, impossible to reach, but those close to him knew he was running from something deeper, the shadows growing inside his own home. Brando's family life was vast, complicated, and fragile. He had children with multiple partners, each relationship marked by intensity, conflict, or distance. Some of his children admired him. Others struggled with the emotional scars inherited from a father who oscillated between affection and absence. The chaos that defined his upbringing had seeped, silently and tragically, into the next generation. The turning point came in 1990, a year that marked one of the darkest chapters in Hollywood's modern history. On May 16, 1990, Brando's eldest son, Christian Brando, confronted the boyfriend of his half-sister, Cheyenne, at Marlon's hilltop mansion in Los Angeles. Tensions escalated, words turned into shouts, and then a gunshot split the night over. A young man, Dag Drawley, fell to the floor, fatally wounded. Police sirens, flashing lights, a swarm of reporters, it all descended on Brando's home within minutes. A family already strained by decades of emotional instability was thrust into an international spectacle. Inside the courtroom, Christian claimed the shooting was accidental, the result of trying to protect his sister from abuse. The trial dragged on for months. Cameras recorded every tear, every glance, every tremor in Brando's voice. Archival footage from that time reveals a man nearly unrecognizable. Brando stood outside the courthouse, shoulders heavy, breath labored, his once magnetic presence dimmed by grief. At 66, he looked decades older. He wept openly, something the public had rarely seen from him, his hands trembling as he addressed reporters. The rebel, the icon, the titan of American cinema, was now just a father drowning in sorrow. And the nightmare didn't end there. In the years following the trial, Cheyenne Brando, once a striking Tahitian beauty, succumbed to her own mental health struggles. The weight of guilt, trauma, and depression overwhelmed her. In 1995, at just 25 years old, she died by suicide. The news broke Marlon Brando in a way no scandal, no professional failure, no public humiliation ever had. He later said her death felt like a blade to the soul. From that moment on, he retreated almost completely from public life. Friends described him as a ghost, moving quietly through rooms, speaking softly, rarely showing emotion. The man who once commanded every camera now avoided them like poison. His weight ballooned again, his health deteriorated, and he rarely left his home except for essential appointments. The world called it the decline of a legend, but for Brando, it was simply survival. There are rare photos from his final descent. Brando in oversized shirts, leaning on railings, eyes sunken, hair unruly, the charisma of his youth replaced by a fragile, almost childlike sadness. These images, raw and unfiltered, show the truth behind the man. A man haunted not by fame, but by loss. Meanwhile, Hollywood whispered. Some said he was paranoid. Others said he was broken beyond repair. But those who knew him understood the more painful truth. Brando had spent his life running from the wounds of his childhood, only to watch them replay themselves in his children. By the end of the 1990s, Brando wasn't battling studios, critics, or the public anymore. He was battling memory, his own and the ones he wished he could erase. The chaos, the scandals, the self-destruction, all of it had led here to the quiet ruin of a man who once changed the world. By 1990, Marlon Brando had already endured decades of chaos, failed relationships, studio wars, volatile public image, and emotional wreckage left by his own childhood. But nothing, not even the darkest corners of his career, could prepare him for the night that would rip his entire world apart. It happened inside his own home. On the evening of May 16, 1990, Brando's hilltop mansion in Los Angeles, usually a place of controlled privacy, became a crime scene flooded with police lights. His son, Christian Brando, had shot and killed the boyfriend of his half-sister Cheyenne. The chaos unfolded in seconds. Panic, confrontation, gunshot echoed across the hills, and then the shattering silence of life abruptly ending. Neighbors watched from their windows as patrol cars and ambulances swarmed the property. Reporters gathered before the sun rose. For years, Brando had feared the cracks in his family fiber. That night, they split open the door. Inside the police station, Christian, shaken, distraught, claimed he fired the gun accidentally while trying to protect Cheyenne from a violent relationship. The story shocked me. Hollywood rushed to dissect every detail. And in the middle of it all stood Marlon Brando, frozen in a nightmare. He couldn't write, couldn't perform through, couldn't escape. The courtroom became a stage unlike any Brando had ever known. There were no scripts, no retakes, no directors to shield him. Only cameras, microphones, flashing bulbs, and cold machinery of the law. Footage from inside the trial showed Brando leaning forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped tightly as he pulled himself together. His once commanding voice faltered as he spoke by himself. His eyes, so expressive on the screen, now held a kind of pain that felt almost unbearable to witness. The world expected the legendary actor to maintain his composure. Instead, he broke. His voice cracked. He wiped tears as he begged the court for mercy. The tabloids called it weakness. Those who watched closely knew it was grief. Christian was sentenced to 10 years for manslaughter. When the verdict was read, Brando closed his eyes and lowered his head, as if absorbing a blow to the heart. The cameras caught everything. The trembling jaw, the struggle for breath, the sorrow that made the most powerful man in Hollywood look suddenly small. But the tragedy was far from over. Brando's daughter, Cheyenne, spiraled deeper into despair. Already struggling with depression, the death of her boyfriend pushed her into a darkness she couldn't climb out of. She blamed herself. She blamed the world. And in her confusion, she sometimes blamed her father. Her mind unraveled slowly at first, then violently. Brando tried to help, arranging treatment, flying between Tahiti and Los Angeles, holding her hand through hospital corridors, but he couldn't reach her. In 1995, just 5 years after the shooting, Cheyenne died by suicide. She was only 25. The news hit Brando with the force of a collapsing universe. He withdrew from public life almost entirely. Friends said he barely spoke for days. Others said they found him staring blankly out windows for hours, his breathing shallow, as if the air itself hurt. He once admitted privately that losing Cheyenne shattered something that cannot be put back. Photographs of Brando during this era are painful to look at. His shoulders seem permanently slumped. His eyes hold no fire, only exhaustion. His once powerful presence melts into a quiet, defeated silhouette. Each rare image feels like a glimpse into a soul, carrying a weight too heavy to express. The tragedies did not just scar him, they hollowed him out. His relationship with acting dissolved. Scripts piled up untouched. Interviews were turned down. Hollywood's brightest star slipped into near total seclusion. The man who had once dominated screens now avoided them. Fame, which once felt like a cage, turned into a distant echo. All that remained was grief, and the long shadow of a family tragedy that never truly ended. For Brando, 1990 wasn't just a breaking point. It was the beginning of the end. After the tragedies of the 1990s, Marlon Brando slipped into a chapter of life defined not by spotlight or scandal, but by silence. He was once a man who dominated every room he entered. Now he moved like a shadow through the halls of his home, avoiding the world that once worshipped him. To the public, he became a recluse. To those few still close to him, he was simply a man mourning in slow motion. Brando spent much of his later years in two places: his Los Angeles residence and Tetiaroa, the private Tahitian island he once purchased as an escape from Hollywood's artificial glamour. The island had been a symbol of freedom in his youth, a paradise untouched by paparazzi, where where he swam, laughed, and dreamed of a life lived on his own terms. But in his final decades, Teiaroa carried a different meaning: refuge, a quiet world where grief could breathe without interruption. His health began to deteriorate rapidly. The years of emotional strain, weight fluctuations, and stress took a heavy toll. He suffered from diabetes, heart failure, and chronic respiratory problems. Simple tasks, climbing stairs, walking long distances, speaking for extended periods, became difficult. Photos from these years show him in oversized shirts, leaning heavily on chairs or railings. His body weighed down not just by illness, but by memories. Yet, in private moments, Brando remained intellectually curious. He read obsessively: history, psychology, politics, philosophy, searching for meaning in a world that had given him everything and taken just as much. He wrote pages of notes, letters never sent, reflections never published. Friends would later describe these writings as haunting, full of regret, wisdom, and the lingering pain of a man who felt he had failed the people he loved most. Despite his isolation, Brando continued to speak out on causes he cared deeply about. He supported indigenous rights, environmental protection, and humanitarian issues. Some of his final public statements weren't about acting, fame, or Hollywood. They were about justice, dignity, and the responsibility of those with power to protect the vulnerable. It was a surprising yet fitting shift for a man who had spent his entire life resisting control and fighting for authenticity. But even with these glimmers of purpose, loneliness dominated his final years. The laughter that once filled his Tahitian home was gone. His children visited sporadically, some maintaining close bonds, others keeping their distance. Brando spoke less and less, sometimes disappearing into long periods of introspection. He knew he wasn't just nearing the end of his career, he was nearing the end of his story. On July 1st, 2004, Marlon Brando died at the age of 80. His passing was quiet, almost gentle, in stark contrast to the turbulence that defined his life. There was no dramatic farewell, no final performance, only a slow exhale, a fading light, and a legacy that would echo long after he was gone. The world mourned a titan. Those who knew him mourned a man who had been trying to heal his entire life. Marlon Brando left this world quietly, but his impact has never stopped reverberating. Even now, decades after his death, actors study his performances frame by frame, searching for the alchemy that made him unlike anyone before or after. He didn't just elevate acting. He tore it open, exposed its bones, and rebuilt it through the raw truth of human emotion. With A Streetcar Named Desire, On the Waterfront, The Godfather, and Apocalypse Now, he permanently altered the language of cinema. Directors still speak of him with awe, not because he was flawless, but because he was fearless. He played characters the way people actually feel: messy, contradictory, wounded, alive. His work paved the way for every modern actor who embraced vulnerability as power. De Niro, Pacino, Nicholson, Ledger, they all grew from the seeds Brando planted. But legacy is more complicated than awards, technique, or influence. For Brando, it was tangled in questions he never stopped asking. What does success mean? What does fame take from a man? Can someone escape the past that shaped them? In the final images we have of him, there is no trace of Hollywood's perfect rebel, no meticulously lit portraits, no crafted myth, only gray hair, softened features, tired eyes, and a depth that feels almost oceanic. The world once saw him as untouchable. But those last photos tell the real story. A man who endured, who loved imperfectly, who suffered deeply, and who tried again and again to understand himself. People remember the scandals, the controversies, the contradictions, but they also remember the electric presence, the sensitivity hidden behind his rebel exterior, the brilliance that made entire theaters fall silent. They remember a man who changed the art of storytelling forever. If life is a stage, Brando's performance was not a tragedy or a triumph. It was a revelation, a reminder that genius is often inseparable from pain, that beauty fades, that fame is fragile, and that the human soul is far more complex than any image projected on a screen. As the curtain falls on his story, one truth remains. Marlon Brando was not just a legend. He was a mirror held up to the cost of being human.